more tragedy, more violence, and people say they want to understand why and how these sorts of things happen, but I don't think they do, really. I think rather they want to confirm their own biases. They want to cast blame. They don't want to understand. They just want to confirm what they already believe, or to blame what they already believe to be the cause. Video games have been thrown around again by mainstream media as some kind of cause of all this. And of course this fits into the broader conversation of tribalism, extremism, radicalization, all of these other topics that have been going on for best part of a decade now, I guess, at least over half of a decade. So let's actually try and look at this. Shooters, extremists, these tend to be the disaffected and the outcast from amongst us. There is a misplaced blame that is put upon a lot of these kids, a lot of these guys, a lot of these white young men. They're blamed for all the ills of society. They have to carry the weight of history on their shoulders. And yet, if you suggest that maybe they're getting a bum deal, or that maybe they are genuinely the victims of racism or whatever, you will get accusations hurled at you. Not for sympathising with their extremism, but merely for sympathising with the fact that maybe if the goal was equality, then blaming white people, blaming men, blaming heterosexual people, blaming cisgender people as a whole, as a block, as a blank slate for oppression or nastiness or whatever else in the past just isn't fair. That is a step too far. Just saying, hang on a minute, if the goal is equality, why are we treating people differently? That's seen as somehow fascistic or right-wing, when that was the left-wing view for decades. The idea of equality, the idea of fair treatment, the idea of equality before the law, these are all left-wing, primarily socialist concepts that have grown out of liberalism as a natural extension of it. And yet to suggest that maybe we should treat these kids, these young men, with equanimity, that they need help, this goes against a narrative that has emerged from the more radical fringes of the left, and it is that narrative that is radicalizing people and making them vulnerable to the whispered promises of the far right. Now, my ancestors, your ancestors, may have done horrible things. At some point, everybody's ancestors have done horrible things. We don't carry the guilt or the blame for what they've done any more than we should carry the guilt or the blame for what someone else has done now. If someone else commits a murder who happens to share an identity trait with me, meaningless. You know, there is no commonality for us. I carry no responsibility for what they do. They do. But we can look at the causes, we can try to understand them, and we can try to make these things less common in future by addressing why they do happen. And I do think a big part of this is disaffection, racism, sexism, misandry, whatever you call it when you're prejudiced against people because of their gender identity or their sexuality. There is no path to redemption for people. They are being victimized, they are being left behind, and it's not just the removal of privilege, though that's the wrong term to use. It is an active victimization, it is an active marginalization, something we all were supposed to be against, and which even the stupidest person can read as being hypocrisy. And that's a problem. And we say we want to know, we say we want to understand why these things happen, why people lash out, why they commit these mass murders. And yet we move to censor the places where they tell us why they're doing it, where they tell us how they're doing it, where we have perhaps a chance of picking up on them and counter-arguing them or preventing what they're doing from happening. Manifestos have long been published on Chan boards that tell us exactly why these people are doing what they're doing. If we censor that, if we cut that off, not only do we lose all the benefits of having an anonymous place to discuss or to whistleblow or to leak or whatever, but we also lose the opportunity to genuinely understand why these things are happening. But like I said, I don't think people really want to know why they're happening, because they will ignore a manifesto that tells you exactly why someone did what they did, and they'll look for something else, even when it's laid out in black and white in the deranged ramblings of whoever the latest shooter happens to be. These people are rendered vulnerable to extremists, and not just extremists on the right, but extremists on the left as well. What is the better message if you're feeling marginalised and downtrodden and feel that there is prejudice against you? What's the better message? That you are a horrible sinner who deserves everything that happens to you, or that you are somehow superior, better, that what is being done to you is unfair, is being inflicted upon you by traitors, or some kind of nebulous philosophical, political or racial enemy? What is the better message? That white people are inherently inferior or evil or bigoted, that they have dominated and controlled the world for thousands of years through underhanded means and horrendous means? Never mind that every civilization, every race has millions of skeletons in its closet. Or is it more appealing to suggest that you are superior, that you are better, that your lack of success is due to you being cheated?
The stab in the back legend becomes the election issue. The consequences of defeat, collapse of the political system, and the exorbitant demands of the victor nations divide the republic. For the German nationalists, the dagger in the back of the fighting troops is an effective propaganda tool to use against the left.
We can reverse the races or the genders or whatever else it might be that this is about, and you'll find examples like the Black Hebrew Israelites or the Nation of Islam, who preach racial superiority from the other direction as a way to appeal to people who might feel downtrodden or inferior or exploited or whatever else. So you see that happening that way. On the left, so-called, there's another form of appeal that will drag people into extremism, and that is that while you can never wipe the slate clean, you can at least deflect your guilt by blaming others, by attacking others, by holding others to nebulous and ever mobile standards. That you can assuage your own white guilt by casting blame onto other people who are less woke than you. You can hold institutions to impossible standards. You can invoke racism where it doesn't exist, or sexism where it doesn't exist. You can make an argument for these things. Then you can attack your own people to assuage your own guilt. That humanity is one people. And our actions as a society tend to confirm the prejudices and theories that emerge from this. When we introduce stop and search in impoverished, crime-ridden areas, it's received as racism because those areas tend to be full of immigrants and other low-status people in our society, because they tend to be the poorest, and that's where crime tends to happen more, where people are desperate. If you censor conservatives, if you censor the right wing, if you take Chan boards offline because an extremist posted there or a manifesto was posted there, what does this do? It confirms their biases, it confirms their theories that they are being persecuted and censored and chased offline, and that there must be some secret special truth to the things that they share with each other. So this is a non-ideal set of actions, because it will only ever confirm their conspiracy theories and cut them off into smaller and smaller areas that become more and more extreme. And that's how radicalization seems to happen. Echo chambers, or echo prisons, that's where you get locked in to something with people who all agree with you, are extremely dangerous. You only ever hear one point of view, and whether it's the Facebook algorithm, the Twitter algorithm, the YouTube algorithm, whatever it is, will tend to serve you up the same sort of things that you're already interested in, the same biases that you already have. The arsehole spiral, which I've talked about in a previous video, is one side. It's like the opposite of a purity spiral. And what it means is that if you get outcast, if you get cut off, if you get censored, the only people who are around, the only people who will talk to you are the worst. You might be bad, they're probably going to be worse, but they're the only people that will talk to you. And because even quite moderate people have been outcast and censored, they're unwilling to censor or cut off or block people from noxious extremes. And so you end up with a group getting worse and worse and worse. And the opposite of that is the purity spiral, where the demands for orthodoxy, for purity, get higher and higher and higher, and people are constantly being cast out of that group. But the group that remains, the core, are in lockstep and ever moving to extremes and constantly having to perform their purity so that people don't question them, question their motives, or cast them out. This is how you get actions like performative wokeness. Or on the opposite side, you get ironic racism, ironic sexism, and so on. Performative sleptness, I guess you could call it. And when you act in a certain way for a long enough amount of time, it can become second nature. It can become real. You fake it till you make it, but what you make it to be isn't necessarily very good. And we know from innumerable psychological studies that an echo chamber, a self-reinforcing group, will always tend to trend to the most extreme point of view in that group. This was applicable to suicide bombings and so on. These small groups, these small units of extreme jihadis trying to prove to each other that they are the most faithful. And that ends in a very, very unpleasant place. Conspiratorial thinking is reinforced by censorship, is reinforced by violence, is reinforced by questions being shut down, even if they are obnoxious, racist or sexist questions. If you won't even have the discussion, you have no chance of de-radicalizing anyone. You have no chance of exposing them to accurate, or at least opposite information. The unwillingness to engage that the modern pseudo-left has, just preferring to censor and shut down. If you're actually against racism, if you're actually against sexism or poverty or whatever else it might be, whatever cause, you have to advocate for it, you have to argue for it. And if you're unwilling to talk to people, if you're unwilling to answer their questions, if you spend no time honing your arguments, having comebacks, having the data, learning the shape of the argument, then you're ceding the ground to the enemy, who will make the arguments unopposed to the people that you refuse to talk to, on the topics that you refuse to talk about. It's hard work, it's unpleasant, but it has to be done if you want to win. And the actual left won these arguments decades ago, and the threat that could roll all of that back is that we no longer advocate for it, we no longer argue for it. So the enemy, if you want to call it that, argues unopposed, against vulnerable people who are feeling victimised, left out, marginalised, gives them a narrative that sounds a hell of a lot better than anything we have to offer, and they never hear a dissenting point of view. Gun violence is an aspect to all of this, particularly in the US. The prevalence of firearms makes the extremism, the polarisation, the tribe mentality that has emerged in whole swathes of the world more dangerous, because it's easier for it to explode into violence, and that violence is likely to be a lot more costly. America's gun issue is unique. While banning guns and grabbing them and getting rid of them would improve matters, it is to all intents and purposes practically impossible in the US. There are changes that could be made. Some seem to be agreeable to both sides of the American debate, of the American political tribalism. Better checks for people with mental health problems, for example. There seems to be bipartisan support for that, but the extremity of what passes for the American left seems unwilling to cooperate with the right, even on that, just to get that one little thing done. There's an all or nothing approach to both extremes, and both sides seem to be hostage to their extremes. The centre ground is increasingly, in many democracies, left alone, left empty. It's more like no man's land between two trenches, and anyone out there stands a good chance of getting shot by both sides. You know, there are modest changes for which there is probably sufficient support, but there's no real attempt to get those. It's all or nothing. And gun control checks probably wouldn't have made too much of a difference in the recent shootings. In one of them, guy had no recent record of mental health issues, mail-ordered the gun, purchased it legally. There was, mental health checks wouldn't have stopped them, so it would have made no difference there. But here and there, it could make a difference. Other options that might be more palatable to people: bullet tax, perhaps, make the price of ammunition high, so that mass shooters are less likely to have as many bullets. High capacity magazines, maybe, you could control. Gun insurance, licensing, treat it similar to cars, where you have to pay a fee to license your weapons every year, year in, year out, or you have to get insurance. So if your weapon gets used in a violent manner, the insurance company pays out, and the victims get some kind of compensation. That would drive up the cost of owning firearms, but it wouldn't make it illegal to own firearms, and it would provide a way to compensate for the societal harm that the firearms do. That might be acceptable. Change the firearm culture. Make anyone who wishes to own a particular kind or set of firearms a reservist. Give them training, make the training mandatory, a well-regulated militia. There you go. If you want to make arguments, you have to make arguments that appeal to all four areas: logos, logic; ethos, ethics; pathos, emotion; and kairos, urgency. The logical argument against mass firearm ownership is pretty unimpeachable. They don't provide any extra safety or security, but in some areas they're necessary for hunting, self-protection against wildlife, that sort of thing. The ethical argument is also fairly obvious. What's the cost? What's the benefit? Do we want to live in a society that is one bad day away from a gun massacre every day? The emotional arguments are especially obvious. Dead kids, dead mothers, dead fathers. Urgency also seems to be obvious as this seems to escalate. But this doesn't just apply to gun violence, it applies to every area. You need to appeal to people on all of these bases. And the pro-gun argument is primarily emotional, with a side order of ethics. The anti-argument tends to be logical, and that doesn't necessarily appeal to people, just like economic arguments don't necessarily appeal to nationalists or whatever else the case might be. How do we solve the extremism problem? You have to take heat out of the system. That means more centrist positions. That means using alternatives to censorship, which only feed into the problem and make it worse. We have to police our circles, whether we're conservative or liberal, whether we're left-wing or right-wing. Wherever we might be, we need to police our circles. We need to challenge people on the things that they're saying. We need to be willing to speak up and say, hey, I'm not down with this. This sounds a bit extreme to me. Medanagan, nothing to excess, right? We need to expose ourselves to other points of view, and we need to expose our friends and our circles to other points of view, whether we agree with them or not. If you read the Daily Mail, make a point of reading the Guardian. If you read the Guardian, make a point of reading the Telegraph. Whatever it is, whatever sites, whatever groups that you go and you listen to, make sure you also listen to the opposite and hear the other points of view and weigh and measure those arguments. You know, it all starts with us as individuals and our individual actions, our individual thoughts, aggregate on a much larger scale. Make the arguments. This is an appeal mostly to people on the left, mostly to liberals. Make the arguments, have the arguments, challenge people, debate them. Even if you think the issue is settled, make the argument. Make sure you know every in and out of the argument and challenge people when they go against it. Don't just try and censor them or tell them to educate themselves or whatever the catchphrase might be that gets you out of having to do any work. The arguments never end. It's never won. You have to understand the shape of the argument, the nature of the argument, the facts. People genuinely believe in a flat earth, and that was settled millennia ago. We have to keep having the arguments. There are past examples we can look to of what to do and what not to do about extremism, about fascism, about racism. There was Rock Against Racism, which is a fine example from the past in the UK, from the late 70s through the 80s. Rather than demonize and ostracize and cut out the white working class lads that were being disaffected, being poisoned, being recruited by the far right, they engaged with them. They gave them something else to do. They gave them a way to mix with and learn to understand the other. There's always a danger with this sort of thing of being...
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
kids. And seeming a bit fake and false. And the internet has pretty much killed subcultures, but still, that kind of thing, outreach, mingling, mixing, learning the other side is human, works. During the referendum here in the UK about EU membership, a lot of people who voted Leave did express racist points of view, or at least xenophobic points of view. And ironically, those views are most prevalent in the country where people of other races are least common. In places like metropolitan cities, where people are cheek by jowl with people of other races, other cultures, where multiculturalism is a day-to-day experience, the prejudice and the hatred and the xenophobia is much less. So one of the solutions to this problem is to have people mix and understand that we're all human, to see by example, to lead by example. Street violence doesn't help. People like to cite the Battle of Cable Street, but the fact that the fascists were attacked and the fact that they peacefully removed themselves from the area gave them a huge shot in the arm, almost resurrected the movement, you might say. Because compared to the Bolsheviks and the others who were attacking them in the street, they seemed reasonable, peaceful, and so on. And when it comes to protests and violence on the streets in the US and the UK, often, but not always, it is Antifa and Black Bloc and other groups like that that are seen as the violent aggressors. Rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter. What matters is what's perceived, what's received, what's seen to be happening. And that creates a lot more sympathy for the far right. And so it goes with censorship as well. Censorship fed and helped every single fascist movement in Europe in the 1930s. From Mussolini's fascists to the Nazis to the British Union of fascists. Wherever they were censored or cut off or not allowed to speak, that created sympathy for them and gave their beliefs a mystique. Made them more interesting and appealing. So that doesn't help. Fight. Argue. Debate. That's how you win. Mock. Ridicule. Sue. That's how you win. Not by doing this. You're merely repeating the mistakes of the past. And as I said, this all starts with us as individuals. It is up to us to do things. It is up to us to expose ourselves to other points of view. It is up to us to learn the arguments and to make the arguments. Logos, ethos, pathos, kairos. That is the only way really out of this mess, is to mock and punish the extremes on all sides. And to make the effort, and it is an effort, to argue, to educate, and not to become bigots in our attempts to control bigots. Zang.
I'll define the clan and all who come